Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Talking Recruitment, the REC webinar with me, Neil Carberry, and my colleagues Kate Shoesmith and Lorraine Largy. Welcome along to the REC's head office in London for today's webinar. As you can see from our opening slide, just maybe starting to feel a little bit of the Christmas spirit. But we'll see how we feel on that as we go. As always with Zoom, we're just taking a few seconds to let everyone in. So if you could just let us know in the Q&A box or the chat box that you can hear us okay, that's always worth checking in. Thank you very much for that. So let's begin then. This is the first time I think we've done one of these since we moved into our new office in our new studio with everyone here. So it's nice to be back together again to talk to you. Shall we kick off with the first slide? So plan for today, as I said earlier, joined by Kate Shoesmith, our Deputy Chief Exec. Hello, Kate.
Hello, Neil.
And by Lorraine Largy, our Chief Standards Officer. Lorraine, good to see you.
Good to see everyone.
I believe there may be some things to talk about on holiday pay.
I suspect there may be a few things to talk about on holiday pay.
Excellent. There's nothing like some holiday pay action. So what we're going to do today, you can see the agenda here. We're going to run through four things. One, what we're seeing in the economy. Secondly, our legal update, particularly looking at those holiday pay stories that we've seen in the last few weeks, but also picking up on, I think, a lot of activity on the legal helpline about that. Then looking at our focus into next year at the REC, and finally rounding off with thinking about where we are on campaigns as we prepare for a 2024 general election. And we've seen in the last 24 hours, haven't we, Kate, the scale of very swift and very potentially business negative decision making when on highly political topics like the immigration system.
We really have, and there's been quite a lot of interest in some of our feedback, and particularly good to see member reflections that it does support what they're hearing up and down the line from clients and across the supply chain.
And actually, one of the things that we've seen this year at the REC is a greater degree of cooperation between sector federations, us and our colleagues. And in fact, I had a call with the Permanent Secretary at Department for Business this morning just to discuss member feedback on yesterday's announcements. And it's fair to say, while the call was friendly, the exchange of views was frank. So always on the beat for you on that, and we'll come back to that later. But let's start with where we think the market is. Let's move this slide on. So we'll start with a kind of a question for you. What, sitting here in the first full week of December, what do you think you see in your business in 2024? So that classic recruiter optimism, we're going to have growth on 2023 next year, or is it more steady as we go? We're going to maintain possession, but we're not expecting that big growth next year. Worries about a slight contraction, or are we at action stations that we've not actually seen the bottom of the drop in volume? Really interesting to see where people come out on this, because I think this year, Kate, it's been a story about different sectors having some very different experiences.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about getting your reflections, and obviously we can't see how people vote in this poll at all, so it's entirely anonymous to you, is I think sometimes that if with the benefit of hindsight, you look back on what was a stellar year in 2021, unexpectedly so, and into 22, and a lot of recruiters that I spoke to played that forward, as did their clients, into 23 in terms of hiring intentions and the thought. But that quickly dropped away in certain key sectors. Some things entirely without out of control, let's put it that way. So when you have a really wet spring and lead up to Easter, and there's that pressure there, weren't expecting inflation to run away quite as extraordinarily as it did. So some of those factors play into a bit of a dampening down, but only in certain markets, whereas others we weren't seeing quite the same. And some of that is still playing out now. Digital is the one that's always worth watching, because we've seen a real stretch there.
And construction, of course, which is always first in and first out to things like this, and a big gap between temp and perm this year, which we'll go on and talk about. Let's close that poll off now and have a look at the results. So I think, to be fair, team, that is probably where we'd expected it to be. So most people maintaining position, maybe slight growth, and then that's about 60% of respondents. And then slightly next is smash it, which is good. Classic recruiter optimism, head up, shoulders back, let's go and do it. But a reasonably concerned group as well. So about 21 thinking contraction. Thankfully, action stations is last. So I think what you'll hear from our data that we'll look into now, it matches that quite well. Let's move on. So if we think about where the UK labour market is, first and foremost, it's defined by where the economy is. And actually one of the reasons why we went really hard, so hard we talked ourselves onto the front page of today's FT on yesterday's immigration for work changes, is that growth is at the heart of everything for the UK now. We have a post-war high tax burden, and we will still have one despite the tax changes made by the Chancellor in the autumn statement. We have public services that are in need of spending. The only way you square that circle or complete that triangle is through economic growth. The big story in the autumn statement, let's be clear, was the OBR's growth downgrades. So while this year was better than the OBR expected, the next few years were actually not as positive. Now, the good news is it is certainly clear now that inflation is going to gradually return to target, and we're seeing that come down faster than expected last month. And I think that trend should continue towards reaching the 2% target in 2025, but maybe earlier in 2025 than previously expected. Overall, therefore, potentially economically, we've now seen the bottom of the cycle. The problem is that the recovery it's a gentle jog rather than a sprint. And because of that, I think what we'll see is a long period of slow activity in the labour market, but set in the context, and Kate, we set out the figures here, of a labour market that after the year we've had is still remarkably tight.
Really tight. And actually it chimes in with, so the last point on this slide talks about how that's going to be the close watch that the Bank of England and others will pay to what they do around inflation, and particularly obviously interest rates as their measure to control it. There'll be a really close look at pay rates and wage growth. And so Mark's asked a question about the national living wage increase, which is obviously something of an outlier, if you like, in terms of what we've been seeing over the last decade. So there's part of the measure there is you can see what the Low Pay Commission were trying to do. They were trying to catch up with what has been very slow pay growth in lower paid roles since the financial crash. But I think, again, Mark, that points to this point about the national living wage increase, which will hit from April next year, is it points to that sectoral split. So there'll be certain key sectors that will find that really hard to control for, particularly when business will be thinking about how do they control other cost base across their businesses, and where do the people sit there. But for the vast majority of clients that we're hearing from right now via members, they're saying that they still need to look to hire in order to meet current production requirements. So there'll be that playoff. Whether that means then you don't invest further in other facilities will be something that we'll be looking at really closely. But I think that's perhaps why you don't see some of the respondents saying that they see the statutory wage increase is playing a big part, because it'll only affect certain sectors. And
this is a big part of this sectoral story, as you say, Kate. If I look at the responses to the autumn statement, if you're manufacturing, happy days. Full expensing is an enormous investment. If you're in hospitality, well, the small business rates multiplier that was frozen actually is a small premises rates multiplier. In most hospitality businesses, it doesn't apply to. You've got a 10% increase in your wage rates because whatever is happening, you're paying a rate that's defined by the minimum wage, and you've got other on costs that have been rising. So there's definitely something here, and I think it speaks to our reaction to yesterday's immigration news as well, where we do have a tight labour market. There's very few ways for minimum wage sectors to avoid passing through those increases to prices. So one of the concerns in talking to economists at the moment is about whether we're actually moving beyond the period of domestic of international inflation that's affected us, and into a period where as growth picks up, we might see some significant domestic inflation driven. So that piece around, while undoubtedly interest rates will fall, and interest rates are critically important, particularly to temporary employment businesses, while those interest rates will fall, they're not likely to recover in the medium term or even the long term to the sorts of levels we've been used to for the last decade or more. It's one of the reasons why we're talking with our colleague Maxine Bly about using our business advice to look more at client risk assessment and payment terms in the first part of next year. That feels like an incredibly important issue, especially in an environment where we've got firms who are client firms who are maybe more exposed to risk than they have been for a while. So I think cautious, but not doom-laden about the market next year. There definitely is growth there. And actually, I think on balance, the OBR is probably a bit negative on growth. I think we might, for reasons I'll go on to set out now, I think we'll see a rather better year than that. And I largely am where 60% of you are about our performance as an industry next year. Let's move the slides on. So the single thing that makes me most hopeful about next year is the graph on this slide, which essentially says that your clients are more confident about investing and hiring into their own business month on month now, just gently more confident. So that's that slow uptick than they have been for a long time. And you see that light blue line on the graph dropped in early to mid 2022 into the negative, recovered this summer into the positive, and is hanging around in a slow month-on-month growth. Now, the dark blue line is what do clients think about the economy more generally, and you can see that basically clients react quicker in their own business because they can see the numbers, whereas the dark blue line is more driven by what they can see in the press and in what they hear from other businesses. That feels to me like some gentle positivity. And so I've been talking to a lot of members around the country over the last couple of months. And I think some of the volatility of the market that was there through last year has dissipated. I think people can see a bit more of a trend. And hopefully that's the beginnings of what is a more positive 2024 for us. As always, these slides will be available after the webinar, so no need to take vast amounts of notes as we pass by, and we'll put the recording up on YouTube as well. Let's move the slide on again. So linked to that, I mean, overall activity in the labour market remains pretty robust. This is our jobs postings data. We're still seeing a high level of jobs postings. Of course, sometimes recruiters are using the opportunity of a quieter market to bring in candidates a moment like this. But we're definitely not seeing a withdrawal from the market, despite the sort of the weak trend that we had in permanent recruitment in particular over the course of this year. So broadly, I think the trend that we've been seeing is still actually a robust level of activity. And as we'll see in the next slide, dropping in perm and sort of holding position in temp, but for some quite specific reasons. Let's move that slide on again. So looking at that and looking at your billings numbers, which is now a widely used measure by the bank and others, we've seen permanent billings dropping for over a year now. Now, not at precipitate rates. I mean, you can compare the drop we're seeing at the moment with both the financial crisis and the COVID crisis on the graph there. But I think a permanent market across all sectors that's maybe 15 to 20% down this year, and has gently been looking like it's recovering in later on in the year. Meanwhile, the temporary market has been hanging around flat all year. And the story there is that we get from members and from the survey is essentially that increasing temp pay has offset slightly lower temp numbers, and firms in lack of confidence are leaning more to temp in certain sectors. All of those averages, though, hide significant complexity. Some sectors, construction, IT, have had a weak year. Other sectors, anything in the blue collar space like logistics, heavy engineering and manufacturing, healthcare have had a much stronger year. So under the surface, there's a lot more change going on than I think you can see that. And one of the things that we'll be trying to do for you next year is just pick apart some of those trends to make sure that you're making the right decisions about where you're focusing your attention through the year. The other thing to say about wages is wages have picked up, but now they seem to be dropping back to more normal trend. They're still rising, and certainly feedback from across the membership suggests that whereas last year it was the labour market that was driving wages up, this year it's pay awards in companies moving to catch up that are driving wages up, and we expect pay to continue to fall back to more normal levels of growth through the first part of next year, national minimum wage rise accepted. Let's move the slide on. If you're in the mood, have the appetite for more data, remember our annual survey, the Recruitment Industry Status Report, is out next Monday, so that's available for you then. The size and contribution of the industry, really important to our own sense of ourselves, but also the trends, all available from Monday, and a really good piece of work here, I think.
Yeah, it's quite comprehensive, and this is always our most downloaded and used report. It's not just used by the recruitment market. What's interesting for us is the number of larger client businesses, financial institutions, and the policymakers that look to some of this data, because it gives them a real-time sense of where things are going before we get the official numbers, because this is always partly a look back on what we think has happened based on your survey responses, but we also do some forecasting looking forward. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting to compare your answers about where you see the market go with what we've got from the data when that comes out next week.
Fantastic. So look out for that, and we'll move the slide on one more. And, occasionally we'll like to blow our own trumpet, but what's really interesting is at the moment, your data, the standing of the industry, is being taken really seriously in Whitehall, Westminster, and the city. So just two examples here. One's a quote from the Bank of England and the value of your billings data, the report on jobs to policy making. And one is our excellent mention in the autumn statement. So both the government and the bank now increasingly using REC data, your data, to make policy decisions. And that, of course, gives us some route to sharing your insight with government and policymakers and making some arguments around the policy that is needed to unlock the labour market. And, without making too heavy-handed a link, some of the influence the REC's had on holiday pay over the last period has been driven by the fact that we have a really strong and robust level of conversation with government at the moment. Let's move the slide on one more. So if that is where we are with the market, I'm really interested in your feedback in the chat and the questions. We wanted to spend some time today with that most Christmassy of issues, holiday pay, because so much is changing so fast. So Lorraine, you're going to take us through all the latest.
Yep. Thank you. So we've got a busy couple of months on the legal side, and I will make plenty of time for the holiday pay questions and queries that I'm sure are going to come up. But just in terms of what's on the horizon for the industry, starting with IR35. So the off-payroll rules that came in April 21 left an outstanding issue of how tax could be dealt with in the situation where hirers had made an incorrect status assessment. So of course the changes have shifted the liability from PSCs to intermediaries, but where clients made an incorrect assessment of the contractor status, there wasn't a way to ensure that there wasn't a double taxation. So this is something the REC has been pressing HMRC to change. There will now be a change coming into effect for next April, which will allow HMRC to take into account setting off the taxes where there's been an incorrect status assessment. So that's something we've been quite loudly advocating, and that's a welcome change to see for next year.
Good change for the industry.
It's a very good change. So we're pleased to see that. So that's one piece on tax. Just move on to the next slide. So this is now sort of starting to warm up to the holiday pay issues. But again, as I said, it's been a busy period. In October, we saw the Supreme Court hand down a decision on a Northern Irish case. Now, this case has been sort of moving through the court, and it's dealing with how claims for holiday pay could be made, especially when there's been a series of underpayments of holiday pay over a period of time. Previously, it had been ruled that the 3-month cut-off period for holiday pay claims would prevent workers from claiming back monies over a longer period of time. But in the decision of Agnew and the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, effectively this goes in workers' favour, because it means that if they have underpaid holiday payment, which are linked, even if there's been a gap of 3 months, which would ordinarily break the claim, they will still be able to claim those sums. So it could mean that someone who's been working for quite a period of time, if they've had holiday pay underpaid over, for example, a couple of years, even with a break of 3 months, which would normally sever the claims they could bring, they will still be able to bring those claims over a longer period of time. So that is in favour of workers. So it's something employers need to take into account. For Great Britain, however, for England, Scotland and Wales, we have specific legislation that does create a 2-year cut-off period, so a backstop, as you could describe it. So there is a limitation, a total period of a 2-year period that a worker could go back. However, I suppose it's the irony of this being a Northern Irish case, that piece of legislation doesn't apply in Northern Ireland. So potentially claims brought by workers in Northern Ireland could go beyond the 2-year period. This
is actually quite an important point about Northern Ireland, and it's one of the reasons why our campaigns team are putting together a specific manifesto for Northern Ireland at the moment, because of course a lot of the issue in Northern Ireland is that there hasn't been a devolved government for a very long time to take any action on this. And there's almost a dam of things that need to be addressed building up. So one of the things that we're really keen to do is be ready for the return of devolution in NI, especially as, of course, NI is the only part of the UK that has devolved employment law. Yes. So one of the things that we'd be really keen to do is engage with members in Northern Ireland about how we tackle this over the course of next year. Yeah, I mean, devolution is important, devolved government, but some consistency on some of the really key issues around employment is what I think all employers want to see. Okay, if we could pop on to the next slide, please. So I think this is probably the area which members will have a lot of questions about. So last month we saw the publication of, a bit of a mouthful, but the Employment Rights Amendment, Revocation and Transitional Provision Regulations for 2023. And this has brought into legislation some issues that have been looked at in 2 previous consultations on the working time regulations and holiday pay. In short, as a summary, the regulations are going to clarify some aspects of the working time regulations, and I'd say correct some of the fallout from the Harper and Brazel case from last year. I suppose the headlines from these provisions are that we now have a specific definition of irregular hours workers for the purpose of statutory leave, and also a definition for part-year workers.
But specifically, we will see put into legislation, so a legalisation of the use of rolled up holiday pay for both irregular hours workers and part-year workers, using what I would describe as the long tried and tested 12.07% accrual method, which has certainly been in place since I joined the REC in 2008. And that method had been called into question by a body of case law, which had sort of held that it was unlawful in terms of the European Working Directive, which is what the working time regulations are based on. But you know, it's something that the REC has lobbied government about long and hard for, that we need a mechanism that works with irregular working for agency workers. So I think it's a welcome relief to see that this has now been put into legislation, and this will address a lot of the concerns that had come up following the Harper and Brazel case last year. There's also some other bits that the legislation is dealing with. So from the time of COVID, there had been some provisions put in place to allow workers to carry over their leave where they hadn't been able to take it. And those provisions will end next March. And in relation to TUPE, the transfer of undertakings regulations, there's some bits in here that will make it easier for small businesses to deal with consultation when there is a transfer. So that's the provisions. I'm not sure if any questions have popped up.
So I have one that I keep being asked. If you want to find a calculator for 12.07, where do you go?
Well, we did previously have a calculator, which we had sort of taken down from our website post Harper and Brazel, so that will be reinstated. The government also has a calculator. We also are expecting to see guidance from government on these changes coming out in January, so they may have some details in there, but we will be able to reinstate our calculator, which was much used prior to the Harper and Brazel decision.
One other, what about REC templates? What's the plan there?
Yep. So as you can expect, as ever, the legal team are first of all, what they've done is they've provided an FAQ document which covers all of the changes, and that's available on our website. And in terms of contracts, they're currently working on amendments to the REC contracts. As I said, the government guidance is due to be published in January. We had sort of pressed to try and get sight of that beforehand. But I will just add that the changes that have come in for the rolled up holiday pay will apply to workers whose leave year is after April next year. So whilst we will look at publishing the contracts for January, we just want to sort of get sight of that government guidance just to make sure that there's nothing that we've missed, make sure we've got everything in. That's really.
Well, there's a big question there about that first bullet point on your slide, isn't there, Lorraine, about the definition of an irregular hours worker for the purpose of leave, which we've been discussing with DBT?
Yeah, so we have had a lot of questions from members about why there isn't a specific reference to a contract for services in the legislation. I think the reference to the irregular hours workers is wider and gives more scope, but essentially what we're looking at is whether or not the contract that the worker is working under has variable hours. So in most instances, we know that our members use a contract for services. Some members do use a contract of employment, but the contract won't specify hours because there isn't any guarantee. So that's really the essence of the irregular hours, whether the hours are wholly or mainly variable under the contract itself. And the changes we'll be making to our contracts will make that very clear that those workers are in scope. So yes, as I said, the changes will come into effect for workers whose leave year is on or after April next year, but updated contracts coming out very shortly.
Super. So this is your chance to ask any further questions. So while Lorraine is finishing off the legal section, pop any questions you have on this into the Q&A box.
Okay, just waiting for those. I'll just cover just on the next slide, just something that's linked to this. So we did send notices out to members about this last month. We were contacted by the GLAA, the Gang Master and Labour Abuse Authority, to let us know that they were going to be publishing a new brief on holiday pay, which followed the Harper and Brazel decision, but also setting out their suppose, interpretation of the Harp and Brazel case and their view on the use of contract for services, which we were quite concerned about.
It was novel. Let's use that as the euphemism.
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting Friday afternoon that news came in. But essentially,
It's the most shirty letter I've written this year.
appropriately so.
Maybe Trump's the FT today even.
But yeah, the GLAA's view that you know, the contract for services that not only our members but many other agencies would be using was not consistent with the licensing standard that deals with holiday pay on the back of the Harp and Brazel case was a great concern. We challenged GLAA over this, and we worked together with ALP, particularly after the government released the draft holiday pay legislation, which I've just mentioned, well, I think common sense prevailed in that they have backed down from their position, and they've also suspended their brief. So that was good news. Right, before I move away from this, are there any questions?
Nothing in the box.
Okay,
So
quite
I think that
comprehensive.
the letter where they suspended the brief was possibly the best bit of civil service passive aggressive communication I've received. But we caught their hand in the till, and together with the ALP turned them over on it, which is always nice to have a quick win sometimes.
We were pleased.
Yeah.
Like, just go to the next slide, please. So just in terms of some of the other changes which have just come in, again, just towards the end of October, we saw some amendments to the provisions that deal with criminal records. So this is about rehabilitation periods, which is quite important for members who either supply workers in sectors such as education and health, but also if you're not in those sectors and you need to sort of check whether anyone has a criminal record. For many offences, they become spent after a period of time, which means that if people are not doing specific types of work, they can't be asked about criminal convictions, and they're not required to disclose criminal convictions. So these changes have updated the rehabilitation periods, and effectively this will mean that for most criminal convictions, the rehabilitation period will be shortened. So there will be there'll be a lesser need for people to disclose convictions that they've got. But there are exceptions if they are working with vulnerable groups, such as in education and health. So we have updated, again, a lot of our documentation around that, our registration documents, just to make that clear for members. Just pop on to the next slide, please. Just another change for members to be aware of, the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill, which is passed on the 26th of October. So this is dealing with businesses and organisations' requirement to act to prevent fraud. And this applies to sort of larger businesses, so those with more than 250 employees, or those with a turnover of more than 36 million. Or more than 18 million in assets. It's a strict liability offence, so it doesn't require knowledge. So this is something where businesses really need to have measures in place to prevent fraud. And so this legislation came to force on the 26th of October. And next slide, please. And I'll just finish with Regulation 7, a regulation which feels a little bit like the
debate that never goes away.
Yeah. So Regulation 7, I'm sure most of you would be aware, is the provision in the conduct regs which prohibits employment businesses from supplying workers to cover striking workers of the hirer. It was repealed in 2022, challenged. The repeal was challenged by a group that included trade unions. And the High Court, the Supreme Court has ruled that the repeal of Regulation 7 was, I guess, unlawful. This was brought by way of a judicial review. So in July 2023, this decision was made. The government was left with the decision as to whether or not to appeal that. We held our breath. They didn't. But they have now decided to run a second consultation on repealing the regulation because the consultation was flawed, and they've opened that consultation on the 16th of November and they'll close on the 16th of January. We've taken quite a strong position on this? They haven't changed our position. This is
The story here is that I think members have been foursquare behind the idea that inserting yourself into your client's industrial relations is not a great place to be. And I think actually the decision to play it as strongly as we did in 2020 and 2022 had two advantages. One, ultimately, we've ended up on the right side of the debate, as well as the right space for where members want us to be, but also actually, given the change in the politics over the last 18 months, it has softened the debate with the Labour Party with us quite significantly, and I think that is important to acknowledge. I mean, Kate, my view on this would be that they're doing this because they have to do something, and it feels like a very pre-election political move. And maybe with the RMT strikes settling last week, the ASLEF strikes are going ahead this week, but I think they're likely to settle soonish. Potentially the saliency of this issue has drifted away a bit.
I think you're right, and we also have to look at what's been happening in the health sector. So there's obviously new pay deals on the table there for the doctors. So that's and I think this junior doctors still need to settle, don't they? So again, it's taking some of the heat out of this, but it's an embarrassment to have your decision be ruled out and overturned in the way it was by the courts. The courts clearly pointed to the fact that they hadn't consulted effectively enough, so they're now running a consultation. This feels like you do what you do after the horse has bolted to try and repair some of that. Let's see. I'd imagine that given the strength, the feeling, and the vociferousness of the unions around that they took it all the way to the Supreme Court means that they will not be shy of responding to the consultation, and we know how they run these things. There will be thousands upon thousands that respond to this consultation. So then let's see what government do with that weight of evidence.
I think that's right, and to be honest, this, like many things right now, this feels like it's washed up in the fact that we're in the midst of a long general election campaign, which we'll come on to discuss in a second. Just as by way of light relief, my favourite conversation I've had with a civil servant this year was when I said to Civil Servant Department for Business that possibly being quoted in the judicial review judgment was the highlight of my career, along with at the time the Sun says called me a boffin, to which his reply was, pretty sure it wasn't my highlight. But there we go. One of the things to be aware of in all this is that civil servants broadly and the advice to ministers aligns with where the REC is. And that plus the polls suggests that Regulation 7 has a long life ahead of it, and whatever happens in 2024.
Okay, so that's the end of the legal update. But I think good to see there's lots of there for us to do for supporting members well into next year.
Thank you, Lorraine. And any further questions, just drop them in the Q&A. We can come back to them as we go. I'm going to say a little bit about the year ahead for the REC now. Should we move the slide on one, please? So a couple of things that we have done recently to make you aware of. Last Tuesday, we had a fabulous Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Summit here in London. We like nothing better than running another major event 4 days after the REC Awards, but a really cracking discussion. Some of the videos from that, Kate, I believe will be available on the socials over the next few weeks.
Yeah, we're cutting it down so people that weren't in the room can get to share with some of the great insights from speakers.
And what was really powerful was we had members of all sizes from all parts of the country and clients indeed talking about the issues. The most important thing to point to is the guide. There's a link here. It's member-only content. It's a hefty bit of work which looks at your own business and driving EDI, and then helping your clients, broadening out those talent pools that you're fishing in, but also doing it with our eyes open as a commercial priority as well as an ethical one. I think it's a fantastic bit of work. It's the kind of thing I can say when I had very little to do with the drafting of it, and fulfills something that a lot of members had asked for, which is really good, really specific to recruitment advice on equality, diversity, and inclusion. So do take a look at that. Let's move the slide on. Linked to that, next March, we're launching a new training course, which is about how do you have that conversation with your client about EDI. So do check that out. It looks at the advice in the guide. It's designed to be interactive, and it's about building those constructive, value-added discussions with clients that really feed into what we're all trying to do, which is to build a long-term, genuine professional services relationship with our clients, and not a one-off transactional one. Let's move the slide on one. Next up for us is a piece of work called Aim Higher. We committed last year, at the beginning of the year, to do more work looking at clients and trying to move clients from a cost per hire to a value for hire model, using REC data, but also articulating the cost of getting it wrong. We've done a lot of work on that over the course of the autumn. We're going to launch this in January because no one needs even more REC product in the run-up to Christmas. It's aimed at senior levels in client businesses. We want to give you some tools to have that conversation with your clients. We want to support that. Kate, I know you're doing all sorts of work talking to other sectors about this, but also we're using our media profile.
Yeah, so one of the things that's been really interesting about this year, partly because we've seen the difficulties in forecasting, because we've already spoken about this, different sectors have had very different experiences in terms of cost of living, inflation, things that were outside of their control. A number of members have come to us directly and asked that we share some of our data with their client groups. So they may run regular forums. I've been to a couple that are specific to the retail and logistics sector, really interesting one that was entirely for public sector clients, where you can imagine the issues that were front and center for them. Quite different sectors, quite different pulls and pushes. And actually, when we're doing our lobbying of government, it's worth thinking about the fact these employers are also subject to the same rules, and their boss ultimately is the government, and they're really stuck in this pattern. So having outside voices being able to say the things that they can't has been particularly interesting. Very happy for us to do more of that. We can support you if you have events coming up where you think it might be useful to use REC data.
Super. And just to Mark's question, I think you're about to answer it directly with a link to the guide. But when you get the slides, there's a click-through link there as well that you can use. So lots coming on that, and on to the next slide. So now our next poll question. Kate, do you want to introduce this one?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things, and many of you will have joined us for the Savage tour earlier this autumn, where Greg Savage, we can open the poll question if you like, Karen, so then people can have time to vote, was a real sense that actually for your recruitment consultants, they may never have been through anything like a downturn before. What they did is they joined during the boom time of just post-lockdown. And so we were asked for a lot more support for recruitment professionals that perhaps hadn't been through this cycle of the market. We're really going to be investing in that professional pathway across 2024, thinking about what is it we can do to support all of the parts of your business, including those that are perhaps more of what you would consider to be the essential support services, not necessarily just the frontline recruitment consultants. So what we would like here is just your impressions, please, of what you think would, if you had one choice out of all of these, I know you might want all of them, what would you really like to see from us? Would it be about the content and advice for the new joiners, those that are new to recruitment? Anything specific to recruitment consultants? We've specified business development here. It's one thing to be really successful when you have a market where there's huge amounts of availability of roles and a candidate shortage. That's a great market, right? But what about when the flip of that arrives? Is it particular resources for your leadership development team, or is it something that is about the external market, things that we know really matter to clients right now? Whether that is around technology and the use of artificial intelligence, what does that mean for the jobs market, the environmental, the social, the governance aspects, any of those things, or something completely different?
Let us know in the Q&A for that one. I know it says the chat's disabled, so let us know in the Q&A.
Let's go for it.
Let's see what we got. Business development.
Hmm.
That's good. We've got a little plan on that, which we'll tell you about in January. Navigating external developments. Obviously, we did the tech report this year. I think that's super important to keep at that technological side. And the others, a little bit of support for both of them. So that's fascinating. Thank you very much for that. Let's move the slide on. So let's talk about the politics then, Kate, and over to you on this. I've let it be known that Nostra Carberry's prediction is Thursday, the 17th of October, 2024 for the general election. It's a week before half term, and the weather's still nice enough to get the campaigns teams out and about. But we know we're in a long election campaign, whether it's in May or whether it's in January 25. Please God, not a Christmas election campaign. But we're doing a lot of work in this regard, and of course, increasingly having to run with a genuine government and shadow government. So over to you on this.
Yeah. The team asked last week actually what my prediction was, and I thought after the exit of Brevman and Cameron coming back in, I was much earlier now. So I went for 2nd May. So we'll see, because I think there's a 6 and 2 3s to this of how Sunak plays it over the next couple of months. Really interesting behaviour going on. If we move on, so autumn is always a really busy time for any of us working in the policy and campaign areas, partly driven by party conferences. So we made sure, we always do when you are in the build up to a general election, that we have a strong presence there. And I know a number of our members also attended conference this year. I have done conferences for too long. I have never seen a Labour Party conference like it. I remember when we were in the run-up, I remember Gordon Brown's last, and the sort of air of absolute euphoria at Tories in the build-up to the 2010 election. It mirrored that a little bit.
I have to say, I haven't done the Conservatives for us exactly the same in reverse. When you realise that they'd taken all the seats out of the exhibition hall, so people had to keep moving around and it looked busier, and very much a kind of a party with a double party conference, a kind of quite downbeat, very serious government party conference, and then this insurgent party conference around it, who felt like an opposition, where people were flocking to see Liz Truss and they were flocking to see Nigel Farage.
Absolutely. So the point for us is that we maintain a strong presence at these places in order to be able to put across the message of the market and what's happening in the recruitment industry. At the opening of this, we said how important the labour market has become in terms of economic decisions and that fiscal sentiment. So being able to position us there and being seen over and over again, the repetition of hearing about the REC actually does make a difference.
Yes.
So it was really important for us to be there. It's fair to say that on both sides, they are very willing to talk to business right now. We've had a really busy autumn, as I said. So we've had a number of different conversations with the shadow Labour team. We've told you previously about the engagement we've had with Angela Rayner and her team, who are particularly leading around this point about how you ensure that there is two-sided flexibility in the labour market, and the green paper that was put forward around good jobs, but also increasingly important for us to be speaking to Johnny Reynolds in terms of the shadow business team. One of the things that's really interesting about this, plus the shadow treasury team, is you get the impression that these will be the jobs they are in post a general election. So building these links really matter now. For all of the other, there's no guarantee of what happens in any general election. So 2010 was my proof of that, where I spent a huge, inordinate amount of effort on the Tory party. And then you had to run really, really fast to catch up with all the Lib Dems that were now, and for instance, Vince Cable being our business secretary, when I put all of my prep into it being David Willers. So there's no guarantees. It's important that we have that cross section, and we don't know where these people are going to end up in different jobs. in particular. So we're also finding that talking to the current government is obviously exceptionally important. Neil, you were in with Joe Churchill just in the last day.
Just yesterday, yeah.
And it's and there is such a huge effort going on there to think about how does private sector business, and particularly the recruitment industry, support with their biggest problem, which is economic inactivity levels. So there are a number of conversations going on there. And I wanted to add one side note to Lorraine was talking about the changes around the DBS system and about ex-offenders and when you can and can't ask for convictions. There is currently quite a bit of money being put towards, public money being put towards the training of ex-offenders into to be job ready and into workplaces. That means that we're getting approached by employment service providers and by training providers about what's the natural place for them to go next. It would be to a recruitment business. So if you are in the place where this is an appropriate pool of candidates for you, we have one particular provider that is actually in the Yorkshire area who is looking at how do they help more people coming from all different types of backgrounds, but particularly ex-offenders to get into sustainable work. Then please let us know about that, because some of these things are important around how are we showing that we're supporting not just the growth agenda on a macroeconomic level, but also there's real social difference that can be made from recruitment businesses working in tandem with these the social partners in a local community. So lots of different work going on. If we move the slides on, just a couple of points around. We are talking a lot about a general election, and who knows whether we're talking about one that is in 6 or 12 months' time. Business as usual does continue, but with a different tone to it. So we had a very light King's speech nearly a month ago now. That's flown. Where actually we've already been through it. We've particularly spoken about how one area for direct relation to the recruitment industry was around Regulation 7. But a lot of attention being paid to how do we support the skills development of the UK, and perhaps that sets the seed for why there is this big push, and we know why, because it's one of Rishi's 5 promises around migration numbers. So you've got to be showing to do that one push on one hand, with also something that supports the investment in a skills system. But to be quite frank, we're not seeing that coming through just yet. There's a lot of warm words.
So I think on that, there's, and this is the nature of discussion we have with the 10 or 11 other big trade associations who work closely together across the different sectors, is the message to government is you can't say no both sides. So you can't simultaneously clamp down on visas and also ignore business on skills. And so that piece around where is your plan for the workforce and the growth of the workforce and development of the workforce feels incredibly important as a lobbying tool. We think about, I know you're going to talk about our manifesto for January. When we think about our manifesto, part of our job is to hold both parties' feet to the fire on genuine trade-offs they need to make. And some of that is also accepting that some of their preconceptions about how the labour market works, ministers tend and politicians generally tend to assume everyone works like a civil servant, are not correct. I mean, I think I've said on one of these before, I think our challenge with Labour is not that they don't see the value of temporary work economically, it's that they don't see the value of temporary work socially, and that will take some time to address.
Let's move this on one. I couldn't agree more. Won't dwell on this. There's a lot for you to read here, but we've been through a number of these points. We did a full assessment of the autumn statement the other week. Really interesting to see how we were pulled in to Treasury a number of times in the run up to the autumn statement. One of the things that's not listed on this slide, because we'll say it rather than write it down, is how often we were asked about agency caps and controls in the NHS. Real sense for government of, yes, perhaps the budget looks better than initially expected, but they really need to be finding the mechanisms to save money, and us having to point out that you're going after the wrong target because you're looking at the wrong budget line, because your sole focus on the agency costs means that you are forgetting to look at all of the other staffing costs. So a lot of work went into that behind the scenes, but a huge amount of writing and rewriting, I'd say, of this autumn statement right up to the last minute.
One of the curses of being a membership organisation like the REC is that half the time what you're doing is stopping mad stuff happening. And then when it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But I think on agency caps and controls, I think getting out of the autumn statement with nothing in it was quite a good step. And since the autumn statement, we've had some reasonably in-depth meetings with the Treasury about the way forward, which feels like a bit of a breakthrough moment, we can only hope, because they need to think more about, much more flexibly about how to both control spend in the NHS and support service delivery. And I think you do that with agencies rather than against them.
And obviously, and if we move it on, because people can obviously read that and the updates in their own time, for us, we need to think about the entire public sector, because we know there's moves and machinations coming, and if you're not involved with us in terms of thinking about what's happening on social work or the education side, please get in touch, because those frameworks really do matter too. So Neil's already alluded to this, that as political parties start to write their manifestos and their promises to the electorate, what we want to be doing is we want to be informing their thoughts behind that. And the big focus for us is you'll see an update of our manifesto coming in January. We will also have, you've already spoken, Neil, about how we want to ensure that it references all the devolved nations. We will have specific points for each of the UK nations and different documents on that. But we want to ensure that front and centre of all of this is there's a real understanding of what the value is of our market. And we know that the temporary agency market is by far the predominance of the recruitment industry. We want to hone in on this point that there's 1 million people that every single day are working as a temporary agency worker. Why is that? What's behind that? And if you look at the ONS stats, it's telling us that at least a quarter of those are not even looking for a permanent job. So really getting to grips with that and explaining the value that our market brings, and all of that will be with you and available from January this year. Shall we move on to our very last point on this particular section? So we bit of in our geeky world, this is our fun. Sorry.
Yeah, we like this.
Let's open the poll. We just want to hear from you. Last chance for today in terms of any thoughts from you. What would you like the next government? Forget what colour of government it might be, you know, and who might be in what jobs. What would you really like them to be tackling in their first 100 days? Is it to really push on economic growth? Is it to be working with businesses on an industrial strategy? There's the dreaded apprenticeship levy, and will they finally get to grips with that and put it to good use? Or very appetite, given what's happened in the last 24 hours, how about more flexibility into our immigration system? Or last but not least, an employment bill that thinks about enforcement across the entire supply chain. I know which way Lorraine would vote. Yeah. You've got one choice, so let us know.
Smashing the button on the laptop.
Let's close that off so that we
Let's have a look.
Yeah.
So economic growth and high borrowing, and then the Labour party comes second. And I think that's actually not a surprise in terms of, I think a level playing field for the industry feels like a big and important message for us to take to any new government. I think economic growth is the answer to everything. It's the way the tax burden falls, and it's the way we fund public services. And actually, it's what makes yesterday's decision about immigration so challenging, because it has a direct effect on growth. Let's close that off and move the slides on. So one final note, a few dates for your diary. I think most importantly, all of our events are now online. Thank you to Karen for that. On rec.uk.com/events for 24. The next one of these is on the 12th of March. But the most important date of all is the REC Live conference back in person in the summer of next year on the 25th of June. It is the day of England's last group match in the Euros, but it is the England game is in the evening. So come and join us during the day, and then find a nice spot to watch the game in the evening. Karen is delighted because I am going to Germany to support Scotland, but Scotland will have finished their group games 3 days before the conference. So I'm available to present on the day. Do come and join us. It's been a huge ask of members for us to do more in-person events. We're also to the point, as someone made in the question and answer earlier about getting out around the country, we're doing 50% more events in every English region and all 3 of the devolved nations next year as well. So, you know, the REC is an in-person business because value is not just us talking to you, it's the membership talking to each other. So do look out for an event near you and book in to come to London on the 25th of June now. And move the slide on. The rest of the pack has the usual details on upcoming qualifications and again, and upcoming training and again. And that's it. It feels abnormally early to wish you a happy Christmas. But I think where we are, the team have been putting up the Christmas tree outside in the REC reception. So maybe we'll allow ourselves a brief moment of festive feeling. Thank you for joining us, Lorraine. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you to Karen, who holds a ring on this beautifully every time we do it. And all the best for the rest of this year into New Year. Thank you, as always, for joining us.